Welcome to this third session about the stress response and its role in health and wellness. Let me start with the last image that I showed in the previous session, just summarizing how we end up with chronic disease, a state of chronic disease from the beginning on. So our genes determine our sex and our race. These genes are being expressed to lead to the development of our brain, different circuits within our brain. And then we know there's several dangerous things that can happen early on in life during this process of transmission. It can lead to so-called epigenetic changes, modifying the gene expression from what it was from our what we inherited from our parents. So these are early adverse life events, low socioeconomic status, poor nutrition, and possibly antibiotics. Later, once the brain has developed, like in adolescence, something else kicks in, which is this, what we talked about a lot, the allostatic load. So the chronic experience of moderate to severe stress that essentially forces our stress system to do things that are not good for our body. Just to remind you, the acute stress response, a very positive thing, has saved human race from extinction many times before. But this chronic stress load on our brain, which can come either from the environment or also, as we talked about, from an unhealthy diet, and is also associated with a lower socioeconomic status, acts on this developing brain. And ultimately, the kind of systems or networks where we have in our brain that determine its basic operational mode, which is includes motivational drive, resilience, saliency, so the system that assesses how relevant a stimulus from the outside or from the body is, and then the stress response system. So this is the long way that it takes for us to develop a individualized stress response system that can either be very beneficial, it can be hyper responsive, and a lot of it depends on the experiences that we have had in life. So today I want to talk about what's the difference between men and women in terms of the stress responsiveness or the sensitivity to stress-related, for stress-related disorders, and then a greater propensity for chronic disease and not feeling well. And there's certain things that we'll come back to, early adverse life events, and the allostatic loads during adolescence and adult life that play a significant role here. So the question is, are women more sensitive to chronic stress? So we know that from many studies that women are overrepresented in many stress-sensitive disorders, including chronic pain syndromes, affective disorders, anxiety disorders, particularly PTSD, depression, eating disorders, and obesity. There's some other diseases where men or males are more prone to develop them, but in terms of stress-sensitive disorders, all of these disorders are exacerbated by stress or where chronic stress plays a big role in its development in the first place. This is seemingly paradoxical that we have more women presenting with these stress-sensitive diseases, because healthy women compared to healthy men have several features that would seem they're actually less sensitive to the negative effects of stress. So women produce more anti-stress chemicals in the body, both in the brain and in the body. Oxytocin, estrogen, a major factor, and obviously endorphins and many more. Women under stress show better coping strategies rather than, and these are sort of almost like innate coping strategies, rather than the classical fight and flight response, which is characteristic of males, going all the way back to male animals. Women and female animals under stress have been shown to show this tend and befriend response. So they affiliate with each other in order to protect the offspring. They don't seek a fight, and they don't run away to flight response, but they stay put and support each other more in these tend and befriend strategies. So women also show healthier responses to physical symptoms. So in general, for many of these stress-sensitive disorders, the actual prevalence, how often a disease appears in the population, as opposed to how many female patients do you see in the hospital or seeing a doctor, definitely shows that, like in irritable bowel syndrome, sort of a classical disease for that, the ratio of women that seek healthcare for their symptoms is 4:1 to men, and it's 1.5 to 1 for the actual prevalence in the population. So when women have bodily symptoms, they're much more likely to seek healthcare earlier. And again, it goes back to this, they are more concerned about the, being able to take care of the offspring. I personally believe it's a hardwired system in the brain, whereas men sort of try to suppress the symptoms and wait until it's often too late. And then, as everybody knows, as every woman knows, women show a greater ability to endure severe pain, like childbirth. If you see pictures of men getting COVID-19 shot, they grimace their face more than women would do. So certainly that indicates that, besides other factors, childbirth, the meaning to the woman of that kind of pain, indicates that the women have systems, biological systems, that are able to suppress certain kinds of pains better than men do. And so then they also show different responses of the sympathetic nervous system to stress. So they show lower stress autonomic nervous system responses to the same stress than men. A hallmark of a male autonomic response is they engage norepinephrine and epinephrine much more than women do. So in some ways, women should be protected from these stress-sensitive disorders. So then the question is, why then do we have more patients, more female patients with these disorders, if biologically women should actually be more resilient to it? So women are exposed to greater stress loads, the social expectations, single moms, definitely a tremendous stress load on a woman that has to be the breadwinner and take care of children. Whole concept of working moms, the same kind of concept. I see this a lot in our own research environment, how women are able to essentially raise a family and at the same time work, or expected to work as hard on getting grants, research grants, and doing experiments. And then later in life, they're the most likely caretakers of older spouses, also very stress-generating job. So they're definitely exposed to a greater stress load. And there's another thing that we know from studies. The female brain is more likely to make prediction errors towards greater likelihood of negative outcomes. So what this means, a prediction error. So in our system, in our brain, as we've talked about before, there's a system that always evaluates any event that goes on, any perturbation that goes on either around us, at the moment, or inside of us in terms of bodily symptoms. And it also makes predictions for future events. How dangerous and how severe are these events, or how stressful are these events going to be? And in general, the female brain makes these predictions as a bias towards assuming a greater likelihood of negative outcomes of these events, and therefore engages more systems that are associated with that, like anxiety responses and other hormonal responses. And then, even though the female brain has anti-stress mechanisms, we talked about this, the oxytocin, this hormone secretion, that is estrogen secretion, endorphin secretion, that protects a woman against these stress-induced perturbations. These systems are susceptible to the allostatic load that we're talking about. So that situation where there's chronic stress constantly engaging the stress system and leading to a situation where the chronically engaged stress response actually now has negative effects on the body in terms of metabolic situation, in terms of brain function, and ultimately really causing many of these diseases, these stress-sensitive diseases. And as I said on the first slide, so in studies that have looked at the frequency, the prevalence of early adverse life events, I mean, anything that could be from separation of the parents, illness or stress on the primary caregiver, normally the woman, disease of the primary caregiver. Most of these sexual abuse, physical abuse, most of them are more likely or more commonly reported in women. So, and that's sort of a major factor, as I told you, for developing a more responsive stress system. So now we sort of can balance with, on the one side, we have a greater likelihood, greater frequency of stress-sensitive disorders in women. We have a greater likelihood that women will seek medical care for these problems. We have evidence that women are actually quite well equipped to deal with acute stress and acute pain. But because of the protective systems that they have, because they're more vulnerable to chronic, severe, sustained stress, allostatic load, once they lose these protective systems, they actually become more prone for these diseases. So this is all I want to tell you today. We will at some point come back to the various methods that have been used successfully in treating stress-sensitive disorders and enhancing wellness. I'll be talking to you about this in the next 2 weeks. Thank you for your attention.